The mud was cold enough to feel it through his wool uniform, soaking into his chest, his neck, the side of his face pressed flat against the frozen earth. Private Eddie Garrett kept his eyes half shut, his breath shallow, barely moving his ribs. 20 yards ahead, German boots crunched through the snow-dusted dirt, voices low and sharp, rifles slung but ready. He could smell gun oil, wet wool, cigarette smoke drifting back from their column. His M1 rifle lay 3 feet away, half buried in the rut where he dropped it. Dog tags hung cold against his throat. The December air bit at his ears. He didn't move, didn't blink, played dead like they'd taught him at Fort Benning. Only this wasn't training. This was a forest road outside Bastogne, and the patrol that had just walked past him wasn't supposed to double back. But one of them did. Heavy footsteps. A pause. Then the scrape of a boot turning back toward him. Eddie's heart hammered against the frozen ground, but his body stayed still as stone. And somewhere in the tree line behind him, another American soldier, his buddy from the 101st, was watching. What that man did next would either save Eddie's life or seal his grave in Belgian dirt. And before we move on, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story of courage, fear, and survival that shaped World War II. Eddie Garrett had joined the 101st Airborne 3 months earlier, fresh off a cattle ranch in Wyoming. 22 years old and quiet as the plains he'd left behind. He didn't talk much in the barracks, didn't brag, didn't complain. The other men called him Silent Ed, or just nodded when he passed. He cleaned his rifle every night, wrote letters home on Sunday mornings, and ate his rations without comment. In the chaos of the Belgian winter, he seemed like just another replacement. One more private trying to stay warm, stay alive, and follow orders until the war decided what happened next. His buddy was Corporal Danny Rizzo from South Philly, a wiry Italian kid with fast hands and a faster mouth. Danny had been with the 101st since Normandy, survived the drop, survived the hedgerows, survived everything the war had thrown at him so far. He'd taken a liking to Eddie the first week, maybe because Eddie didn't talk back, didn't interrupt his stories, just listened and nodded. Danny liked having someone to talk at, and Eddie, for reasons he never explained, seemed to trust him. They shared a foxhole most nights, passed cigarettes back and forth, and watched each other's backs on patrol. The morning it happened, their squad had been sent out to probe German positions along a tree line 2 miles east of their encampment. 12 men, Sergeant Kowalski leading, moving low through frozen farmland and patches of dense forest. The cold bit through their gloves, their boots crunched too loud on the icy ground, and their breath came out in white clouds that hung in the air like smoke signals. Eddie carried his M1 slung across his chest, his hands stiff inside his wool gloves. Danny walked 3 yards behind him, Thompson submachine gun at the ready, eyes scanning the tree line ahead. They'd been out for 2 hours when the ambush came. Sharp cracks of rifle fire from the woods, muzzle flashes in the shadows, men shouting and diving for cover. Eddie hit the ground hard, rolled into a shallow ditch, and brought his rifle up. Kowalski was yelling orders, but the words got lost in the noise. 2 men went down immediately, one clutching his leg, the other silent and still. Danny fired a burst into the trees, then dropped behind a fallen log. The Germans weren't pushing forward, just laying down fire to pin them, keeping them from advancing or retreating cleanly. Eddie fired twice, saw bark explode off a tree trunk, then ducked as return fire kicked up dirt inches from his face. His heart slammed in his chest. His hands shook, but he kept his breathing steady the way they'd taught him. He glanced left and saw Danny reloading, calm and efficient, like he'd done this 100 times. Kowalski was waving them back, signaling a retreat through hand gestures, his face red and furious. Eddie started crawling backward, using the ditch for cover, his rifle dragging through the mud. The firing slackened just enough for them to move. But then Eddie heard boots, heavy, fast, coming from the flank. He turned his head and saw 3 German soldiers breaking through the brush, trying to cut off their retreat. He shouted a warning, brought his rifle around, but his boot slipped on the icy ground and he went down hard on his side. His M1 flew out of his hands, landed in the mud 3 feet away. One of the Germans saw him, raised his rifle, and Eddie froze. For half a second, everything went silent in his head. Then Danny's Thompson roared, a short burst that sent the German sprawling backward. The other 2 scattered into the trees. Eddie grabbed his rifle, scrambled to his feet, and ran. The squad was falling back in a ragged line, some men firing over their shoulders, others just running flat out through the snow. Danny grabbed Eddie's collar and pulled him along, shouting something Eddie couldn't hear over the noise. They made it 50 yards before the Germans stopped shooting, either out of ammo or unwilling to chase them into open ground. Kowalski counted heads behind a stone wall, 2 men dead, 1 wounded, the rest shaken but intact. Eddie's hands were still trembling when he leaned against the cold stone and tried to catch his breath. Back at camp, nobody talked much about the ambush. It had been a bad patrol, but not the worst. Men cleaned their rifles, smoked cigarettes, stared at nothing. Eddie sat on an empty crate near the mess tent, his helmet beside him. Dirt still caked on his uniform. Danny came over with 2 tin cups of coffee, handed one to Eddie, and sat down without asking. For a long time, neither of them said anything. Then Danny spoke, his voice low and tired. "You froze out there." Eddie didn't answer. Danny took a sip of coffee. "Happens to everyone once. Just don't let it happen twice." Eddie looked at him, then down at the cup in his hands. "I didn't freeze," he said quietly. "I slipped." Danny nodded slowly, like he wasn't sure he believed it, but wasn't going to argue either. He lit a cigarette, offered one to Eddie, who shook his head. Danny smoked in silence, watching the other men move around the camp. After a while, he said, "You ever been in a fight before this?" Eddie hesitated. "Not like this." Danny nodded. "Well, you're in one now, so stay close, stay sharp, and don't slip again." That night, Eddie lay in his foxhole staring up at the black sky, his rifle across his chest, his breath fogging in the cold air. He could still feel the moment his boot had slipped, the weightlessness before he hit the ground, the German's rifle swinging toward him. He'd thought he was ready for combat. He'd thought the training had prepared him. But the truth was, nothing prepared you for the split second when your body failed and someone else had to save your life. Danny had saved his, and Eddie didn't know how to carry that weight yet. 2 days later, their unit was ordered to move up, closer to the German lines. The brass wanted better intelligence on enemy positions, troop movements, artillery placements. Kowalski called it a reconnaissance in force, which everyone knew meant they were going to walk into another fight and hope they walked back out. Eddie packed his gear in silence, checked his rifle, filled his canteen. Danny was joking with another corporal, laughing about something Eddie couldn't hear. But when Danny caught Eddie's eye, the laughter stopped. He gave Eddie a look, serious, steady, and Eddie nodded back. They moved out at dawn, 12 men again, this time with orders to push deeper into the woods and report back anything they found. The forest was dense, the ground slick with ice and mud, the trees bare and skeletal against the gray sky. Eddie walked near the middle of the column, his senses sharp, his hands ready. Every shadow looked like movement. Every distant sound could have been footsteps. Danny was behind him again, close enough to talk, far enough to cover ground. They moved in silence following Kowalski's lead, deeper and deeper into enemy territory. An hour in, they found signs, boot prints in the mud, cigarette butts still fresh, a stack of empty ration tins hidden under brush. Kowalski signaled a halt, crouched down to study the tracks. Eddie knelt beside a tree, his rifle aimed into the darkness ahead. His pulse was steady now. His hands didn't shake. Whatever fear he'd felt before, it was buried under something colder, sharper. Danny moved up beside him, whispered, "They're close." Eddie nodded. Kowalski stood up, made a hand signal to spread out and advance slowly. The squad moved forward like ghosts. Then the forest opened into a small clearing, and they saw it. A German patrol, maybe 8 men, gathered around a small fire, rifles stacked against a fallen log. They hadn't posted a sentry. They were eating, talking, careless. Kowalski froze the squad with a raised fist. Eddie could see their faces across the clearing, tired men just like him, trying to stay warm. For a moment, nobody moved. Then one of the Germans looked up, saw them, and reached for his rifle. Kowalski's Thompson spoke first. The firefight was brutal and fast. Kowalski's Thompson tore through the clearing, followed by a dozen M1s opening up at once. The Germans scrambled for their rifles, some diving for cover, others dropping where they stood. Eddie fired 3 shots, saw one man fall, fired again. The noise was deafening. Rifle cracks, shouting in 2 languages, the wet thud of bodies hitting frozen ground. Smoke filled the clearing, mixing with the fog. Within 30 seconds, it was over. 5 Germans dead, 2 wounded and crawling, 1 running into the woods. Kowalski didn't order pursuit. He signaled to hold position and check the bodies. Eddie moved forward cautiously, his rifle still raised, his heart pounding in his ears. Danny was beside him, reloading his Thompson, eyes sharp and scanning. The wounded Germans were moaning, one clutching his stomach, the other his leg. Kowalski knelt beside the one with the leg wound, asked him something in broken German. The soldier spat blood and didn't answer. Another GI was going through their packs, pulling out maps, papers, a few photographs. Eddie stood over one of the dead men. A young face, maybe 19, staring up at the gray sky. He felt nothing, just cold. Then they heard movement in the trees, the one who'd run. Kowalski cursed, sent 2 men to circle around. Eddie and Danny stayed with the squad, covering the clearing. The wounded German with the stomach wound stopped moaning, went still. The other one just stared at his leg, breathing hard, his face white as snow. Kowalski stood up, wiped his hands on his pants, and looked at Eddie. "You good, Garrett?" Eddie nodded. Kowalski didn't look convinced, but he moved on, barking orders to strip the bodies for intel and get ready to move. They found documents in a leather pouch, maps marked with positions, supply routes, troop movements. Kowalski studied them for a moment, then folded them carefully and tucked them inside his jacket. "This is good," he said quietly. "Real good. Command's gonna want this yesterday." He looked at the squad. "We move fast, stay quiet, get this back to base. No more contact if we can help it." The men nodded, checked their ammo, adjusted their gear. Eddie glanced at Danny, who gave him a tight smile. They were going home. Or at least they were trying. But as they moved back through the forest, something felt wrong. Eddie couldn't name it, just a pressure in his chest, a prickling on the back of his neck. The trees were too quiet, the shadows too deep. Danny felt it too. Eddie could see it in the way he kept glancing over his shoulder, the way his grip tightened on his Thompson. Kowalski set a fast pace, pushing them hard, and nobody complained. They just walked, breath fogging, boots crunching, eyes everywhere. Half a mile from the clearing, they heard it. A single rifle shot, distant but clear. Everyone froze. Kowalski raised a fist. Silence. Another shot. Closer this time. Then voices, German voices, shouting orders. Kowalski's face went hard. "They're hunting us," he said quietly. "Move, double time." The squad broke into a jog, weaving through the trees, slipping on ice, trying to stay quiet and fast at the same time. Eddie's lungs burned. His rifle felt heavy, but he kept pace. Danny was right behind him, breathing hard but steady. Another shot cracked through the air, this one close enough to hear the bullet snap through branches overhead. Someone behind Eddie cursed. Kowalski shouted, "Run!" They ran. No more stealth, no more tactics. Just a desperate sprint through frozen woods with German patrols closing in. Eddie's boots slammed into the ground, his pack bouncing against his back, his heart trying to burst out of his chest. He could hear Danny behind him, could hear other men crashing through the brush, could hear shouts getting closer. Then the ground dropped away suddenly, a steep embankment leading down to a narrow dirt road. Eddie didn't stop, just leaped and slid down in a spray of mud and snow. Hit the road hard, rolled, came up running. But when he looked back, the squad was scattered. Some men had made it down, others were still coming, and 2 were pinned at the top by rifle fire. Kowalski was shouting for them to move, but the Germans were right there now, firing from the tree line above. Eddie saw Danny sliding down the embankment, Thompson in one hand, the other clawing at dirt. Then he saw a German soldier appear at the top, rifle aimed straight at Danny's back. Eddie didn't think. He raised his M1 and fired. The German dropped. Danny hit the road, rolled to his feet, looked at Eddie with wide eyes. Kowalski got everyone moving again, dragging the stragglers, shouting for covering fire. Eddie and Danny fired up at the embankment, keeping the Germans back long enough for the squad to regroup and run. They made it another 100 yards before Kowalski signaled to split up. "They're too close," he said, breathing hard. "We scatter. Meet back at checkpoint Baker. Go in pairs. Move." He grabbed the maps from his jacket, looked at Eddie. "Garrett, you and Rizzo take these, get them back to command, don't stop for anything." Eddie stared at him. "Sarge!" Kowalski shoved the maps into Eddie's hands. Go, now! Eddie and Danny broke off from the group, running west while the others scattered in different directions. The German shouts faded behind them, but Eddie knew they'd be coming. They always came. He and Danny moved through the woods at a hard jog, weaving between trees, jumping over fallen logs, slipping on ice and catching each other. Eddie kept the maps tucked inside his jacket, kept his rifle ready, kept moving. Danny was beside him, breathing like a freight train but still moving. After 10 minutes, they slowed to a walk, listening. Silence. Just their breath and the creak of frozen branches. Danny leaned against a tree, pulled out his canteen, took a long drink. His hands were shaking. Eddie noticed but didn't say anything. Danny wiped his mouth, looked at Eddie. "You saved my ass back there." Eddie shrugged. "You saved mine 2 days ago." Danny laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Yeah, well, I guess we're even now." He pushed off the tree. "Come on. Let's get these maps back before someone else tries to kill us." They started walking again, slower now, more careful. The forest felt like it was watching them. An hour later, they were lost. Not completely, they knew the general direction, but the forest all looked the same, and the cold was making Eddie's thoughts slow and heavy. Danny kept checking his compass, cursing under his breath. They should have hit the checkpoint by now, should have seen some sign of their own lines. Instead, they were just walking deeper into nowhere. Eddie stopped, held up a hand. Danny froze. Eddie tilted his head, listening. There, voices. Low, distant, but definitely voices. German or American, he couldn't tell. Danny heard them too. He motioned for Eddie to follow, and they crept forward, rifles up, stepping carefully. They reached the edge of another clearing and saw them. A German patrol, 6 men, rifles slung, walking slowly along a narrow trail that cut through the forest. They weren't searching, just moving, maybe heading back to their own lines. Eddie and Danny dropped low behind a fallen log, barely breathing. The Germans passed 20 yards away, talking quietly, one of them smoking. Eddie could smell the tobacco. His finger rested on the trigger of his M1, but he didn't fire. Couldn't fire. 6 against 2, and the noise would bring more. Danny's hand pressed against Eddie's shoulder. Wait. They waited. The patrol moved on, disappeared into the trees. Eddie exhaled slowly, but as they started to move again, Eddie's boot came down on a frozen branch. It snapped, loud as a gunshot in the silence. Both of them froze. For a second, nothing. Then shouts from the trail. The Germans had heard. Danny grabbed Eddie's arm. "Run!" They ran again, crashing through the brush, no longer caring about noise, just distance. Rifle fire erupted behind them, bullets snapping through the air, bark exploding off trees. Eddie ducked, stumbled, kept running. Danny was beside him, firing his Thompson backward without looking, just trying to slow them down. They hit another embankment and slid down, hit a frozen creek, splashed through shallow water. Eddie's lungs were screaming now. His legs felt like lead, but he kept moving because stopping meant dying. They climbed out of the creek, scrambled up the opposite bank, and dove into a thick stand of pine trees. The Germans were still coming, shouting to each other, coordinating. Eddie and Danny pressed themselves flat against the cold ground, hidden under low branches, trying to control their breathing. Boots crunched past them, close enough to hear voices. One German stopped, said something Eddie didn't understand. Another one answered. They were searching, methodically, carefully. Eddie's hand tightened on his rifle. If they were found now, there was no talking their way out. The boots moved on. Slowly. Eddie counted to 60 in his head before he dared move. Danny was watching him. Face pale, eyes hard. He motioned, "Stay down." Eddie nodded. They stayed down. Minutes passed. The voices faded. Finally, Danny moved, slow and silent, crawling forward on his elbows. Eddie followed. They made it 50 yards before Danny stopped again, looking at something through the trees. Eddie crawled up beside him and saw it. A dirt road, and beyond it, farmland. Open ground. No cover. And between them and safety, that road had to be crossed. Danny looked at Eddie. "We go together," he whispered. "Fast and low, don't stop." Eddie nodded. They checked their rifles, took a breath, and broke from the trees at a dead sprint. The road was only 20 feet wide, but it felt like a mile. Eddie's boots pounded the frozen dirt. His breath came in gasps, and every second he expected to hear rifle fire. But none came. They hit the other side, dove into a shallow ditch, and kept crawling until they were deep in the farmland, hidden by rows of dead winter crops. Only then did they stop, chests heaving, hands shaking. Danny looked at Eddie, and for the first time since the ambush, he smiled. "We made it." Eddie didn't smile back. He could still hear the boots, still feel the cold ground against his chest, but he nodded. "We're not back yet." Danny's smile faded. He sat up, looked around, got his bearings. "Checkpoint's that way," he said, pointing south. "Maybe 2 miles. Eddie stood, offered Danny a hand, pulled him up. They started walking again, slower now, exhausted but alive. The maps were still tucked inside Eddie's jacket. They'd made it this far. They just had to make it the rest of the way. But as they walked across that frozen field, Eddie felt it again. That pressure, that certainty that something was wrong. He looked at Danny, saw the same tension in his face. And when they crested a small rise and looked down, they saw why. Between them and Checkpoint Baker, spread across the field like a wall, was another German patrol. A big one. And they were coming straight toward them. Eddie and Danny dropped flat in the frozen field, pressing themselves into the dead crop rows, hearts hammering. The German patrol was moving slow, spread wide, rifles ready. Maybe 20 men, maybe more. Too many. Danny's face was pale, his jaw tight. He looked at Eddie, then back at the approaching patrol, calculating odds that didn't exist. "We can't fight that," he whispered. Eddie nodded. "We can't run either, they'll see us." Danny's hand went to his Thompson, then fell away. For the first time since Eddie had known him, Danny looked scared. Not battlefield scared, something deeper. Eddie looked down at the maps pressed against his chest under his jacket. Kowalski had trusted him with them. Command needed them. Men would die if these didn't get through. He thought about standing up, trying to draw fire while Danny ran. Thought about it for 3 full seconds. Then Danny grabbed his arm. "Listen to me," Danny said, voice low and urgent. "You stay down. Play dead if they come close. I'll lead them off, circle back, meet you at the checkpoint." Eddie stared at him. "That's suicide." Danny's mouth twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Maybe. But you're getting those maps home." Before Eddie could argue, Danny was moving, low and fast, angling away from Eddie, making just enough noise to be noticed. One of the Germans shouted, pointed. Rifles swung toward the movement. Danny fired a burst from his Thompson and ran. The entire patrol turned, chasing him across the field. Eddie watched, frozen, as Danny disappeared over a rise with 20 Germans behind him. The sound of gunfire faded into the distance. The field went quiet. Eddie was alone, flat against the frozen earth, maps pressed to his chest, his best friend running to his death to save him. He lay there for 5 minutes, maybe 10, listening to distant rifle cracks and his own hammering heart. Then he heard boots again, close, too close. He didn't move, didn't breathe, just let his body go limp, eyes half shut, face in the dirt, playing dead. 2 German soldiers walked past him 20 yards away, talking quietly. One of them glanced in his direction but kept walking. Eddie felt mud soaking through his uniform, felt the cold biting into his skin. He stayed still. The boots faded. He waited another 5 minutes. Then slowly he started crawling, inch by inch, toward the tree line, toward safety, toward Checkpoint Baker. It took him an hour to cover 2 miles. Crawling, hiding, moving only when he was sure no one was watching. His uniform was caked in mud, his hands numb, his rifle dragging behind him. But he kept the maps dry, kept them safe against his chest. When he finally saw the American positions, sandbags, a machine gun nest, GIs with helmets and tired eyes, he almost cried. He stood up slowly, hands raised, and walked forward. A sentry challenged him. Eddie gave the password, his voice cracking. They let him through. He stumbled into the command tent and collapsed. A lieutenant took the maps from him, looked them over, nodded once. "Good work, soldier." Eddie didn't feel like it was good work. He felt like he'd left Danny to die. The lieutenant sent him to the medic tent, but Eddie refused. He sat outside on a crate, staring at nothing, waiting. Other men from Kowalski's squad trickled in over the next few hours, some wounded, some just exhausted. Kowalski came in last, limping, blood on his sleeve but alive. He saw Eddie and nodded. Rizzo? Eddie shook his head. Kowalski's face went hard. He sat down beside Eddie and didn't say anything for a long time. 2 days passed. Eddie didn't talk to anyone, didn't eat much, just cleaned his rifle, stared at the horizon, and thought about Danny running across that field. On the 3rd day, a jeep rolled into camp. Eddie didn't pay attention until he heard shouting, happy shouting. He looked up and saw men running toward the jeep, slapping someone on the back. Eddie stood slowly, walked over, pushed through the crowd, and there, climbing out of the jeep, muddy and bruised and grinning like an idiot, was Danny Rizzo. Eddie stopped dead. Danny saw him and the grin got wider. "Miss me, Wyoming?" Eddie didn't know whether to laugh or punch him. He settled for grabbing Danny in a bear hug that made Danny yelp. "How?" Eddie started, but Danny waved him off. "Long story. Short version. I ran those krauts in circles for 2 hours, lost them in a creek, stole a motorcycle, and hitched a ride with a tank column heading this way." He looked at Eddie, his expression turning serious. "You made it back. The maps?" Eddie nodded. "Command's got them." Danny closed his eyes, relief washing over his face. "Good. Then it was worth it." He opened his eyes again. "You played dead, didn't you?" Eddie didn't answer. Danny punched his shoulder lightly. "Smart." That night they sat by a small fire, sharing a cigarette and a bottle of something one of the other GIs had scrounged from a bombed-out farmhouse. Danny was telling the story of his escape to anyone who'd listen, embellishing it more with each retelling. Eddie just listened, the way he always did. But when the others drifted away and it was just the two of them, Danny got quiet. He looked at Eddie across the fire. "You would have done the same for me," he said. Eddie thought about it. "Yeah," he said finally. "I would have." Danny nodded. "I know." The next morning, a captain Eddie had never seen before walked into camp and asked for Private Eddie Garrett. Eddie stood, confused, while the captain looked him over. "You're Garrett?" Eddie nodded. The captain glanced at a clipboard. "Says here you delivered intelligence under fire, evaded enemy contact, and completed your mission when your unit was scattered." Eddie didn't know what to say. The captain kept reading. "Also says you were recommended for commendation by Sergeant Kowalski." Eddie blinked. "Sir, I just—" The captain held up a hand. "You did your job, soldier. That's all we ask." He handed Eddie a piece of paper. "You're being reassigned. Report to Battalion HQ tomorrow, 0800. Eddie stared at the paper, reassignment. He looked at Danny, who was watching from across the camp. Danny gave him a small nod, like he'd known this was coming. Eddie didn't want to leave. This was his unit, his squad, his buddy. But orders were orders. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket. That night, he and Danny didn't talk much. They just sat together, smoked, and watched the stars. Before dawn, Eddie packed his gear. Danny walked with him to the jeep that would take him to HQ. They shook hands. "Stay alive, Danny." Danny grinned. "Always do." Eddie climbed into the jeep. As it pulled away, he looked back once and saw Danny standing there, Thompson slung over his shoulder, watching him go. Eddie wondered if he'd ever see him again. The jeep drove for an hour, winding through bombed-out villages and muddy roads, until it reached a command post behind the lines. Eddie was escorted into a large tent where a full colonel sat behind a field desk, studying maps. The colonel looked up when Eddie entered, saluted, and stood at attention. The colonel returned the salute, then gestured for Eddie to sit. Eddie sat, confused and tense. The colonel leaned back in his chair, studying Eddie with sharp, intelligent eyes. "Private Garrett," he said slowly. "Or should I say, Captain Garrett?" Eddie's stomach dropped. The colonel smiled faintly. "Yes, we know. Took us a while to figure it out, I'll admit. You did a good job covering your tracks when you transferred into the 101st. Eddie didn't move. The colonel tapped the file on his desk. "West Point, class of 41. Served as a training officer stateside until you requested combat duty. They tried to keep you behind a desk, but you pulled strings, changed your records, and slipped into a replacement unit as a private." Eddie's throat was dry. He'd thought he'd buried it deep enough. Thought no one would look. The colonel kept talking. "Your father's a 2-star general. Your brother's a colonel in the Pacific. You come from a long line of officers, and yet you chose to fight as an enlisted man." The colonel's tone wasn't accusatory, just curious. "Why?" Eddie looked at the floor. I didn't want special treatment, sir. I wanted to see what real soldiers go through. Wanted to earn it. The colonel nodded slowly. Well, you earned it. Kowalski had no idea who you were. Neither did your squad. You just fought like everyone else. The colonel stood, walked around the desk, and looked down at Eddie. But now we have a problem, Captain. You can't stay enlisted. Not with your training, not with your record. We need officers, and we need good ones. Eddie stood. Sir, my squad? The colonel cut him off. Your squad will be fine. Corporal Rizzo's a good soldier. He'll take care of them. Eddie wanted to argue, but he knew better. The colonel handed him a new set of orders. You report to the 506th as a company commander. Effective immediately. Dismissed. Eddie saluted, took the orders, and walked out of the tent into the cold morning air. He stood there for a long time, holding the paper, feeling the weight of it. He thought about Danny, about Kowalski, about Silent Ed from Wyoming who'd just been another private trying to survive. That man was gone now. In his place was Captain Garrett, an officer with responsibilities he'd tried to escape. But the colonel was right. He couldn't hide anymore. He'd seen what real soldiers went through. He'd fought beside them, bled beside them. And now, maybe, he could lead them. He folded the orders, put them in his pocket, and started walking toward his new command. The war wasn't over, and neither was he. Years later, after the war ended and Eddie returned to that ranch in Wyoming, he kept a photograph on his desk. A grainy, black-and-white image of 12 men standing in the snow outside Bastogne. Danny Rizzo was in the front row, grinning at the camera. Eddie was beside him, quiet and unsmiling, just another GI. No one looking at that photo would know that Eddie had been an officer hiding in the ranks, or that Danny had saved his life twice, or that the maps they'd carried had helped break a German offensive. They just looked like soldiers. And in the end, Eddie thought, that's all they ever needed to be. Eddie never told anyone back home the whole truth. His father knew, of course. The army knew. But the men he'd fought beside, Danny, Kowalski, the others, they never found out until decades later, at a reunion in Philadelphia, when an old army document surfaced and Danny read it with shaking hands. He looked at Eddie across the table, this old man with gray hair and tired eyes, and said, "You son of a bitch, you were an officer?" Eddie just smiled. "I was a soldier, Danny. Same as you." And Danny, after a long moment, laughed until tears ran down his face. "Yeah," he said finally. "Yeah, you were. Stories like Eddie's, they don't get told much anymore. The men who lived them are leaving us one by one, taking their memories with them. But these stories matter. They remind us that courage doesn't always wear stripes or bars. Sometimes it wears mud and wool and walks quietly beside you, never asking for recognition, just doing what needs to be done. If you believe stories like this should be remembered, if you think the sacrifices of men like Eddie Garrett and Danny Rizzo deserve to be passed down to the next generation, then please, subscribe to this channel. Help us keep these voices alive. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling us about a veteran you knew, a grandfather who served, a neighbor who never talked about the war, but carried it with him every day. These men didn't fight for glory. They fought for each other, and the least we can do is remember them.